Over the past several months, through conversations with diplomats, artists, law enforcement professionals, educators, historians, and civic leaders, a recurring theme has emerged. One I did not initially set out to explore directly, yet it has repeatedly surfaced beneath discussions of leadership, trauma, diplomacy, public service, and art. That theme is this: culture is not decorative. Culture is institutional infrastructure. We often think of infrastructure in terms of roads, levees, pipelines, ports, bridges, drainage systems, power grids, telecommunications, to name a few. Those things matter tremendously, but beneath all of them exists another form of infrastructure, less visible, more difficult to quantify, but equally essential. Trust, memory, identity, shared rituals, food, music, language, stories, intergenerational connections, a sense of belonging, a belief that a place is worth preserving. These things are not luxuries. They are the social architecture that allows communities to endure pressure, absorb trauma, and maintain continuity over time. And that brings us to Louisiana. Recently, the United States Supreme Court addressed procedural questions tied to long-standing Louisiana coastal litigation involving Chevron and other energy companies. The lawsuits concerned decades of coastal land loss, environmental degradation, and restoration obligations associated with oil and gas activity in Louisiana's wetlands and coastal regions. For those unfamiliar with the broader issue, Louisiana has experienced one of the most severe rates of coastal erosion and land loss in the world. Over many decades, a combination of industrial activity, canal dredging, levee systems, shipping infrastructure, natural subsidence, flood control projects, and environmental change altered marshlands and wetlands that historically helped protect communities from storms, flooding, and ecological collapse. Local governments and coastal authorities argue that portions of this environmental damage were never properly restored and that long-term consequences have increasingly destabilized parts of the state, its coastline, and surrounding communities. The energy companies, meanwhile, have argued that aspects of these activities occurred within federal regulatory frameworks and under broader national energy priorities, including periods tied to wartime production and federal oversight. The Supreme Court's recent ruling did not determine whether the companies are ultimately liable for Louisiana's coastal erosion. Rather, the court addressed whether portions of the litigation may proceed in federal court instead of Louisiana state court. But beyond the jurisdictional dispute lies a much larger question. What exactly is being damaged when environments that sustain communities are degraded over generations? The answer is culture itself. One of the strongest observations about Louisiana came from New Orleans artist Jamar Pierre. At one point in our conversation, he described Louisiana with one phrase: Amazon rainforest. He explained how early Europeans described the region as abundant with food, fresh water, wildlife, rivers, fisheries, and fertile land. He spoke about Louisiana as a place shaped by the Mississippi River, the Gulf, the bayous, and the wetlands. He talked about growing up hunting, fishing, visiting family in river parishes and bayou communities, and seeing firsthand how urban and rural Louisiana constantly interacted. His observation matters, because Louisiana's culture did not emerge separately from its geography. The food, the music, the dialects, the migration patterns, the architecture, the rituals, the labor, and even the pace of life were shaped by water. Jamar described New Orleans culture as a mixture of tensions and balance. The sunshine and rain, the pain and joy, the urban and rural, the African, European, Caribbean, and indigenous influences constantly intersecting. He described Congo Square not merely as a historic location, but as a place where enslaved people preserved traditions, rhythms, spirituality, foodways, and identity under immense pressure. He described Mardi Gras Indians not simply as costumes or spectacle, but as cultural endurance rooted in resilience, adaptation, and survival. That is culture functioning as infrastructure. It preserves identity under stress. And when the environment sustaining those communities deteriorates, the cultural systems rooted in those environments become more fragile as well. Remove the wetlands, destabilize the fisheries, increase storm vulnerability, displace communities, and eventually you begin eroding the conditions necessary for cultural sustainability itself. That is why coastal degradation cannot be understood solely as an environmental issue. It is not merely about land loss. It is about whether the social and cultural fabrics rooted in that land remain viable over time. Louisiana's wetlands do not merely protect property. They protect communities, and communities preserve culture, and culture in turn preserves institutional and societal resilience. Another guest, Raelle Myrick Hodges of the Contemporary Art Center of New Orleans, made perhaps the clearest statement in the entire theme when she said, "Culture is not a luxury, it's infrastructure and it's people." That sentence resonated with me, down to my core, because modern societies increasingly struggle to measure value beyond immediate financial return, efficiency, or quarterly performance. But many of the things that actually hold societies together cannot be fully quantified. Culture performs institutional functions. It transmits norms, it preserves memory, it creates belonging. It stabilizes communities during crises. It provides psychological endurance during periods of uncertainty. And several guests reinforced that idea from very different perspectives. Sophia Riggio spoke about opera not as elitist performance, but as communal storytelling. She described wanting audiences to interact with each other during performances, to talk, react, and engage collectively, rather than consume art passively. She described music as something capable of helping people understand themselves and communicate more effectively with others. At one point, she said something remarkably simple yet profound. The more art that you create, the better you know yourself. And then she expanded further. Better self-knowledge leads to more informed decisions, better communication, and ultimately healthier societies. That is not merely an artistic argument. It is an institutional discussion. Similarly, Jamar Pierre described his mural project not simply as public art, but as preserving untold stories, honoring forgotten communities and people, and teaching younger generations about Louisiana's history. He repeatedly emphasized research, collaboration, historical fairness, and inclusion. In other words, culture preserving civic memory. And this becomes highly relevant to the Chevron litigation, because environmental instability does not merely damage ecosystems, it destabilizes schools, churches, family networks, small businesses, music venues, neighborhoods, social clubs, and cultural continuity itself. After Hurricane Katrina, people did not merely return because of economics. They returned because of identity, neighborhoods, because of rootedness, because culture anchored them psychologically and socially and emotionally. As someone born and raised in New Orleans, it is what has kept me connected over the years and distance, despite my path taking me elsewhere. Culture was and is infrastructure. This is also where Ambassador Tim Davis's reflections become important. He began his career in the United States Marine Corps before moving into the Foreign Service, serving in high-stakes environments and eventually as U.S. Ambassador to Qatar. In discussing leadership, he returned repeatedly to accountability and responsibility and the cost of doing leadership well. He described learning from his father, a Marine, and from Marine Corps leaders that good leadership involves dedication to mission, accountability, and responsibility for those who work for you. But he did not romanticize leadership. He said good leadership comes with a price. Sometimes that price is personal advancement, because good leaders spend time ensuring others are recognized. Sometimes that price is physical risk. Other times it is psychological weight. It is the unseen burden of placing yourself between danger and those entrusted to your care. That insight is highly relevant to the Chevron case because stewardship is also costly. It is far easier for institutions to optimize, extract, litigate, defer, and compartmentalize than to absorb the cost of long-term responsibility. Davis also described the Marine Corps as an institution that strips away ego and rebuilds people around mission, discipline, and resilience. He acknowledged that this can produce strong leaders while also noting that institutions can become too narrow in what they imagine leadership should look like. They can become myopic. They can overlook discretion, judgment, and the gray areas that often turn good leaders into great ones. That observation applies far beyond military service. Institutions of every kind, corporations, agencies, courts, legislatures, and civic bodies, can become trapped inside narrow definitions of success. Profit may become the mission. Compliance may become the mission. Winning litigation may become the mission. Economic development may become the mission. But stewardship asks a larger question. What is the mission for the community over time? Ambassador Davis's transition from the Marine Corps to diplomacy also matters. He described moving from an environment where execution and command are central to one where persuasion, patience, and influence matter. That shift illustrates one of the central tensions in institutional life. Some problems require decisive execution. Others require listening, persuasion, humility, and the ability to live with complexity. Louisiana's coastal crisis requires all of the above. It requires engineering, law, regulation, and execution. It also requires persuasion, public trust, historical memory, and moral imagination. If the issue is treated only as a legal dispute, something is missed. If it is treated only as an engineering problem, something is missed. If it is treated only as a corporate balance sheet issue, a whole lot is missed. Davis's reflections remind us that leadership requires the willingness to bear cost for others. That is the essence of stewardship. And when institutions avoid that cost, communities eventually pay it instead. Another recurring theme throughout many of these interviews has been, as stated, stewardship. Retired Ambassador Luis Moreno discussed ethical governance and the importance of integrity even when facing pressure from corruption or geopolitical competition. He described situations where diplomacy required balancing assertiveness with restraint and where America's credibility ultimately depended not merely on power, but on ethical consistency. At one point, he noted that America sells not only products or military hardware abroad, but our way of life, our democracy, our integrity, and our ethical practices. That observation extends far beyond foreign policy. Institutional legitimacy depends upon whether institutions are perceived as stewards rather than merely extractors. Mark Wells discussed economic development and international trade through a similar lens. He spoke about how communities attempt to attract investment and technological innovation while balancing local interest and long-term sustainability. David Meal similarly discussed how small and medium-sized enterprises can become vulnerable when larger economic structures overwhelm them. His discussion about Louisiana crawfish producers confronting unfair international competition was particularly revealing because it illustrated how local communities can feel economically exposed within much larger systems. These conversations all point toward the same institutional principle. Strong institutions require long-term thinking by individuals, not merely optimization, not merely extraction, not merely efficiency. Stewardship. And this is where modern institutions increasingly struggle. We live in a period heavily shaped by abstraction, algorithmic decision-making, quarterly earnings, pressure, bureaucratic fragmentation, political polarization, and institutional distance from consequence. The people making decisions are often geographically, economically, culturally, or psychologically distant from the communities bearing the consequences. That distance matters. because stewardship weakens when decision makers no longer experience the long-term consequences directly. And Louisiana often exists at the intersection of this tension. Industries extract tremendous value from the region: oil, shipping, fisheries, tourism, chemical production, and energy infrastructure. Yet local communities frequently absorb disproportionate environmental, financial, and infrastructural burdens. That dynamic raises a difficult but important question. What obligations do institutions owe the communities and environments that sustain them? Additional insight from my guest involved institutional trust. David Meal discussed diplomacy during COVID in China and how institutions survive crises through teamwork, expertise, and trust networks. Jenny Grumall discussed preserving institutional memory and warned that when organizations stop documenting history or preserving expertise, societies lose accumulated wisdom and begin repeating mistakes. That observation struck me deeply because institutional memory functions very similarly to cultural memory. When communities forget how systems evolved, what sacrifices were made, or how past failures occurred, they become more vulnerable to instability. Ambassador Harry Thomas adds another essential dimension to this point. He described being born in Harlem to parents who had come north from South Carolina during the Great Migration, then growing up in Queens in a community shaped by work, military service, public schools, family networks, and civic optimism. His father served in World War II in Korea. His mother participated in civil rights marches. His father also attempted to register to vote in South Carolina after World War II, facing humiliation and obstruction at the courthouse. Yet Thomas emphasized that these experiences did not extinguish his parents' patriotism or belief in the country. That anecdote is important because it illustrates a difficult institutional truth. Communities can endure injustice when culture, family, service, and shared memory preserve a belief that the future is still worth building. In the context of Louisiana's coastal crisis, that matters deeply. When land disappears, when communities become more vulnerable to storms, when people are pushed away from places that hold family history and cultural memory, the loss is not only geographic, it is civic. It weakens the very networks that teach people belonging, responsibility, and continuity. Thomas's story reminds us that culture is often what carries institutional faith through periods when formal institutions fall short. But that faith is not inexhaustible. If communities repeatedly experience extraction, neglect, displacement, or indifference, trust eventually erodes, much like the coastline. Linda Taglialatela reinforced this idea repeatedly in discussing leadership and workforce management. She emphasized consensus building, listening, bringing diverse perspectives into the room, and recognizing that people often solve problems differently while still arriving at valid solutions. One story she shared was especially revealing. While evaluating opportunities for women in the military, she encountered a senior officer who argued women should not perform certain tasks because they crossed the log over a ravine differently than men. Her response was simple: they all got over the ravine. That vignette captures something important about institutional resilience. Healthy institutions recognize multiple paths toward effective outcomes. Rigid institutions often mistake conformity for competence. Tim Davis made a related point when discussing the Marine Corps. He deeply respected the institution, but still acknowledged that its strength, its shared leadership culture and common identity, could also become a limitation when it left too little room for discretion. The strongest institutions, then, are not those that eliminate variation. They are those that know when shared culture is essential and when adaptation is necessary. That insight matters in Louisiana as well. Communities survive not because they are perfectly efficient, but because they are adaptive, interconnected, and resilient. Jamar Pierre described Louisiana culture similarly: a constant balancing of tension, survival, joy, pain, adaptation, and reinvention. That is resilience. and resilience itself is institutional infrastructure. Another theme emerging repeatedly from these interviews involves complexity. David Meal noted near the end of our conversation that one thing he appreciated about the podcast was an effort to draw out nuance. That observation may actually describe the broader purpose behind many of these discussions. Strong societies require the capacity to think beyond simplistic binaries, and culture helps societies do exactly that. Opera, jazz, murals, ritual, oral traditions, food, history, and storytelling all help people process complexity. Sophia Riggio discussed concerns about shortening attention spans and the difficulty modern audiences have sitting with long-term and long-form artistic experiences. That observation matters beyond music, because democratic societies increasingly struggle with sustained reflection, historical patience, and nuanced thinking. Meanwhile, Jamar Pierre describes spending enormous amounts of time researching history before painting murals because he believed the stories needed to be fair, accurate, and inclusive. Again, that is stewardship, not merely artistic expression, but preservation of civic memory. Tim Davis's career also illustrates the importance of exposure to complexity. He served in the Marine Corps, then entered the U.S. Foreign Service because he wanted to understand how decisions were being made at higher levels. He moved from environments shaped by execution to environments shaped by persuasion. That kind of movement across institutional cultures produces deeper judgment. It is one thing to know how to act. It is another to understand why action is being taken, who bears the cost, and what consequences follow over time. Perhaps that is part of the larger institutional lesson here. Culture slows societies down long enough to reflect. It preserves perspective, it preserves continuity, it preserves empathy, it preserves memory. And those things become critically important during periods of disruption and uncertainty. The recent Supreme Court decision addressed where portions of Louisiana's coastal litigation may proceed, but it did not fully resolve the broader questions surrounding environmental restoration, stewardship, and long-term institutional responsibility. Those debates will continue, and perhaps they should, because the broader institutional questions deserve equal attention. What happens to a society when stewardship becomes secondary to extraction? What happens when institutions become increasingly distant from consequence? What happens when environment-sustaining communities degrade faster than communities can adapt? And what happens when culture itself, our shared memory, continuity, and civic resilience is treated as incidental rather than foundational? Over the course of these conversations, I have increasingly come to believe that culture is not ornamental. It is critical institutional infrastructure. Strong societies depend not only on roads, levees, ports, and pipelines. They also depend upon trust, identity, continuity, shared memory, and the human relationships rooted in place. Tim Davis's reflections on leadership add one final point. Real stewardship carries a cost. It requires sacrifice, accountability, and sometimes the willingness to absorb burdens so others do not have to. That is true in military leadership. It is true in diplomacy. It is true in public administration. And it is also true when institutions benefit from places like Louisiana. Those things cannot be easily rebuilt once lost. And perhaps that is the larger lesson embedded not only in Louisiana's coastal cities, but in many of the institutional pressures facing modern society. The question is not merely whether institutions can generate wealth, rather whether they can sustain the communities that make that wealth possible in the first place. Litigation may determine liability, but litigation alone cannot restore stewardship. We must ultimately ask, do we value culture as part of our infrastructure? Thank you for listening.